Imagine a map of the Atlantic Ocean in 1715, a big one stretched across a wall, the kind you'd see in an admiral's office in London or a colonial governor's study in Port Royal. On the eastern edge, the empires: England, France, Spain, Portugal. Crowns dripping with gold stolen from 3 continents. Monarchs who ruled by birthright, parliaments that served the wealthy, and laws written by men who had never known hunger. Now trace your finger west across that map, past the Azores, past the merchant shipping lanes that carried silk, sugar, and spices back to Europe, past the triangular trade routes, those geometric lines of misery that connected Liverpool to the Gold Coast of Africa to the plantations of Barbados and Jamaica, past the sugar colonies where enslaved men and women died in the cane fields so that English aristocrats could sweeten their tea, past the fortified harbors of Havana and Cartagena, where Spanish treasure fleets loaded silver and gold by the ton. And somewhere in the open water between all of those empire lines, find the ships that flew no nation's flag. Those ships, the ones marked with skulls and hourglasses and bleeding hearts, operated under a system of government that would not exist in any major nation on earth for another 100 years. They voted for their leaders, they impeached captains who abused power, they divided wealth more equally than any European society. They provided disability payments to injured crew members nearly 3 centuries before workers' compensation became law. And they wrote constitutions, actual signed documents, outlining rights and responsibilities, while the kings of Europe still ruled by so-called divine right. This is the story of pirate democracy. And by the end of it, you're going to have a very different understanding of who the real criminals were. To understand how pirates built one of the most progressive democratic systems of the early modern world, you need to understand what they were running from. The average sailor in the Royal Navy or on a merchant vessel in the early 1700s lived a life that would horrify most people today. The pay was terrible. Months would go by without wages, sometimes years. Captains on merchant ships had absolute authority. They could beat you, starve you, chain you below deck, and throw your corpse overboard, and no court in London would blink. Many sailors did not even choose to be there. The Royal Navy practiced impressment, which was a polite word for kidnapping. Press gangs roamed the port towns of England, grabbing men off the streets and forcing them onto warships. You could be walking home from a pub in Plymouth one evening and wake up the next morning on a ship heading for the Caribbean with no way off and no say in the matter. Your family would not know where you were. Your employer would not be compensated. You were simply gone, conscripted into a floating prison for years at a time. Discipline was enforced through violence. Flogging was routine. A captain could order a man lashed to the mast and whipped until his back was raw meat, and the only crime might have been talking back or failing to move fast enough. Before we go any further, I need to stop for a second, because what I've been showing you in these videos only scratches the surface. And I realized at some point that the full picture, the actual pirate code, word for word, the real punishment records, the exact treasure division shares, the ports that secretly funded them, it doesn't fit in a video. I put it all into one document, the Black Flag Codex. It's linked below, and the QR code is on your screen. Now, let's keep going. There was a punishment called keel hauling, where a man was tied to a rope, thrown overboard, and dragged along the barnacle-encrusted bottom of the ship. If the barnacles did not slice him to ribbons, the drowning usually finished the job. Sailors slept in shifts in cramped, disease-ridden quarters. They ate hardtack full of weevils and drank water that had gone green. Scurvy rotted their gums. Typhus killed them by the dozens. And if a sailor survived a 20-year career, he could expect no pension, no support, no recognition. He was used up and thrown away. The officers, meanwhile, ate fresh meat. They had private cabins, they drank wine, and they owned shares in the voyage's profits that common sailors would never see. This was not an accident. This was the system working exactly as intended. The Merchant Marine and the Royal Navy were designed to extract labor from desperate men and funnel profits upward. Captains were kings of their tiny floating kingdoms, and the men who worked the rigging and hauled the anchor and fought off enemies had no voice, no vote, and no recourse. So when a merchant ship was captured by pirates, something strange often happened. the pirates would ask the crew a simple question: "Do you want to join us?" And an astonishing number of them said yes. The popular image of pirates is chaos, drunken violence, random cruelty, lawless anarchy on the open sea. And that image exists for a reason. The governments that pirates threatened had every incentive to paint them as monsters. If the public believed pirates were savage beasts, then hanging them in public was justice. If the public believed pirates were rational men who had built a better system, well, that was a problem. Because the truth is, pirate ships were among the most orderly, democratic, and equitable organizations in the Atlantic world. And the foundation of that order was a document that every crew member signed before a ship ever left port. They called them the Articles of Agreement. Think of them as pirate constitutions. Every ship had its own version, but the core principles were remarkably consistent across hundreds of vessels and decades of piracy. These articles were not suggestions. They were binding contracts agreed upon by every man aboard, and they covered everything from how profits would be divided to what happened if you got your leg blown off in a fight. The articles of Captain Bartholomew Roberts, one of the most successful pirates in history, have survived to the present day. Roberts captured over 400 ships during his career. 400. He terrorized the Atlantic from the coast of Africa to the shores of Brazil to the waters of the Caribbean. And the document that held his crew together through all of it reads less like a pirate code and more like a progressive constitution. Every man had a vote in affairs of the moment. Every man had equal title to fresh provisions and strong liquors. The lights and candles had to be put out by 8 at night. If any man wished to drink after that hour, he had to sit on the open deck. Each man was required to keep his weapons clean and fit for service. No striking one another on board. Quarrels between crew members were to be settled on shore with a sword and pistol under the supervision of the quartermaster. No women were to be brought aboard in disguise. Desertion during battle was punishable by death or marooning. Musicians were entitled to rest on the Sabbath. And crucially, the captain and quartermaster received 2 shares of a prize. The master gunner and boatswain received 1.5 shares. All other officers received 1 1/4 shares. And every ordinary crew member received 1 full share. There was even a provision for early retirement. Any crew member who had served faithfully and wished to leave could petition the crew, and if approved, depart with his share of all accumulated prizes. This was not common, but the fact that it existed at all tells you something about how these men thought about their social contract. You were not trapped. You were not press-ganged into service until someone decided you could leave. You were a free man who had entered into a voluntary agreement, and that agreement included an exit clause. Read the pay structure again. The captain of a pirate ship received twice what an ordinary sailor received. On a merchant vessel, the captain might receive 10 times, 20 times, or even 50 times what a common sailor was paid. On a Royal Navy ship, the disparity was even worse. Pirates had the most equitable pay structure in the Atlantic world. But the articles were only part of it. The real revolution was in how pirates chose their leaders. On every major pirate ship of the Golden Age, the captain was elected. 1 man, 1 vote. Every crew member, from the most experienced sailor to the newest recruit, had an equal say in who would lead them. This was not ceremonial. This was not a rubber stamp on a pre-decided outcome. Pirates genuinely debated, argued, campaigned, and voted. And if a captain was elected and then turned out to be incompetent, cowardly, or cruel, the crew could call another vote and remove him. Captain Edward England, one of the more famous pirates of the era, was deposed by his own crew after they decided he was too lenient with prisoners. They didn't kill him. They voted him out, gave him a small boat and some provisions, and marooned him on the island of Mauritius. Democracy in action. Charles Vane, another notorious pirate captain, was voted out of command by his crew after he refused to attack a French warship. His crew considered him a coward. They held a vote, stripped him of command, and elected a man named John Rackham in his place. Rackham, known to history as Calico Jack, would go on to captain one of the most famous pirate crews in history, a crew that included Anne Bonny and Mary Red, 2 of the most legendary figures in pirate history. The voting was real, the consequences were real, and the principle was simple. The captain serves at the pleasure of the crew. Now think about what was happening on land during this exact period. In England, only property-owning men could vote, which excluded the vast majority of the population. In France, the king was an absolute monarch. In Spain, the same. In the American colonies, voting was restricted to white, land-owning Protestant men. Women could not vote anywhere in Europe. Enslaved people were property, not citizens. On pirate ships, every man voted, every single one, regardless of background, class, nationality, or former station. A former slave who joined a pirate crew had the same vote as a former naval officer. A pressed sailor from the slums of Bristol had the same voice as a merchant's son from Amsterdam. This was radical. This was, quite literally, centuries ahead of its time. But pirates were not naive. They understood a fundamental problem with giving one person absolute power because they had lived under that system on merchant ships and Navy vessels. So they invented a solution: the quartermaster. The role of the quartermaster on a pirate ship had no real equivalent in any Navy or merchant fleet. The quartermaster was elected separately from the captain by the same one-man, one-vote system, and the quartermaster's job was essentially to be a check on the captain's power. The captain had authority during battle. When cannons were firing and men were boarding enemy ships, you needed one person making fast decisions. The crew understood that. So during combat, the captain's word was law. But outside of battle, the quartermaster was the true authority on the ship. The quartermaster settled disputes between crew members. The quartermaster distributed food and drink equally. The quartermaster decided how prize goods would be divided. The quartermaster administered punishment when the articles were violated. And the quartermaster could countermand the captain's orders if those orders were unjust or went against the articles. This was separation of powers. Executive authority in the captain during emergencies. Judicial and administrative authority in the quartermaster during peacetime. Two elected officials with clearly defined and limited roles, each acting as a check on the other. Montesquieu published The Spirit of the Laws, his famous treatise on the separation of powers, in 1748. Pirates had been practicing it for decades before he put pen to paper. The United States Constitution, which formalized the separation of executive, legislative, and judicial power, was ratified in 1788. Pirates had been running their ships on similar principles since the late 1600s. The men who wrote pirate articles were not political theorists. They were sailors, ex-slaves, escaped indentured servants, and criminals. But they had lived under tyranny on merchant and naval vessels, and they designed a system specifically to prevent that tyranny from being replicated. The equality on pirate ships went beyond voting and leadership. It extended to economics in ways that were genuinely revolutionary. When a pirate ship captured a prize, the loot was divided according to the articles. And as we've already seen, the division was remarkably flat. A captain might receive double what a common sailor received. But everyone received a share. There was no scenario where the captain took 90% and the crew split the remaining scraps. Compare this to a privateer, which was essentially a legally sanctioned pirate operating under a government commission. On a privateer vessel, the ship's owner, who usually sat comfortably in London or Boston, received the largest share. The captain received a significant portion. The officers took their cuts. And the ordinary sailors, the men who actually risked their lives, received almost nothing. On a Royal Navy ship, the situation was even worse. Prize money was distributed according to rank, with the admiral of the fleet receiving the largest share, even if he was hundreds of miles away when the battle was fought. Common sailors received 1/4 of the total prize money, divided among themselves. Officers received the rest. Pirates eliminated the middlemen. There were no distant owners. There were no shareholders in London. There were no admirals skimming from the top. Every man on the ship was both labor and ownership. They were worker cooperatives 300 years before the term existed. And then there was the matter of disability compensation. Stop for a second. What you just heard about the Pirate Code is the part that rewrites everything you thought you knew. But it only lands when you see the actual shares, the exact fractions written into the Articles of Agreement, the punishments, the port records, the names of the men who funded them from government offices. It's all in the Black Flag Codex, linked in the description. 5 seconds. Grab it now, because what comes next builds directly on it. Link is below. QR code is on your screen. The pirate articles of nearly every major crew included specific provisions for men injured in battle. Captain George Lowther's articles specified that a man who lost a limb in combat would receive an additional 150 pounds or slaves to that value. Other articles specified different amounts for different injuries. Loss of a right arm was compensated differently than loss of a left arm because the right arm was considered more valuable for work. Loss of an eye, loss of a finger, loss of a leg, each had a specific compensation value written into the articles. Captain Henry Morgan's Buccaneers, operating decades before the Golden Age, had an even more detailed system. 600 pieces of 8 for the loss of a right arm, 500 for the left, the same for legs, 100 for an eye, 100 for a finger. These numbers were agreed upon before any battle was fought, which meant that every man who sailed into combat knew exactly what he was entitled to if the worst happened. There was no ambiguity. There was no room for a captain to deny a wounded man his due. This was insurance. This was workers' compensation. This was a social safety net for men who were injured in the course of their work. In the early 1700s, England would not pass its first workers' compensation law until 1897. The United States would not do so until 1908. Pirates were providing disability pay to their crews 2 centuries before the most advanced nations on Earth thought to do the same. One of the most remarkable aspects of pirate democracy was its racial composition. The golden age of piracy coincided with the height of the Atlantic slave trade. European powers were kidnapping, transporting, and enslaving millions of Africans. Slavery was legal, normal, and central to the economies of every major European empire. The sugar plantations of the Caribbean, the tobacco fields of Virginia, the cotton plantations that would later define the American South, all of them ran on enslaved labor. And yet pirate crews were frequently multiracial. Black pirates served alongside white pirates, and in many documented cases, they received equal shares and equal votes. Captain Samuel Bellamy's crew on the Whydah included significant numbers of formerly enslaved Africans who served as full members of the crew. When the Whydah sank in a storm off Cape Cod in 1717, the survivors who were captured and put on trial included several black crew members. The colonial authorities were so disturbed by the racial composition of the crew that it became a talking point at the trial. Blackbeard's crew was estimated to be roughly 60% black. Some were formerly enslaved people who had escaped or been freed when pirate crews captured slave ships. Some were free black sailors who had joined voluntarily. And according to the available evidence, they served as equals on the ship. This was not universal. Some pirate crews were as racist as the societies they came from. Some captured enslaved people and sold them. Pirates were not angels. But the fact that pirate democracy, at its best, extended across racial lines makes it even more remarkable when you consider the context. At a time when the most enlightened European thinkers still debated whether black people were fully human, pirate ships were holding votes where black and white sailors had equal voices. The story of the Republic of Pirates in Nassau, Bahamas, takes everything we've discussed and amplifies it to the scale of an entire settlement. By 1706, Nassau had become a haven for pirates. The town had been burned by the Spanish and French multiple times, and the British colonial government had essentially abandoned it. Into that vacuum stepped the pirates. By 1713, after the War of the Spanish Succession ended and thousands of privateers suddenly found themselves unemployed, Nassau became the pirate capital of the Atlantic. At its peak, the Republic of Pirates was home to somewhere between 1,000 and 2,000 pirates. It was a functioning community with its own economy, its own social rules, and its own rough form of governance. The big names were all there. Benjamin Hornigold, who had started as a privateer during the war and simply refused to stop when peace was declared. Henry Jennings, who raided a Spanish salvage camp and showed up in Nassau with a fortune in stolen silver. Charles Vane, who terrorized merchant shipping with a cruelty that made even other pirates uncomfortable. Jack Rackham, whose flamboyant clothing earned him the name Calico Jack. Anne Bonny, who abandoned her husband to join Rackham's crew and fought with a ferocity that witnesses described as terrifying. Mary Read, who had spent years disguised as a male soldier before ending up on a pirate ship. And Edward Teach, better known as Blackbeard, who lit slow fuses in his beard during battle to make himself look like a demon emerging from smoke. Sam Bellamy passed through before his famous and fatal voyage on the Whydah. Nassau operated on many of the same principles as individual pirate ships, just scaled up. There was no king. There was no appointed governor. Disputes were settled through council, not dictate. Hornigold acted as a kind of informal leader for a time, but his authority was based on respect and consensus, not on any title or decree. When he made decisions that the community disagreed with, his influence waned. When other captains rose in stature, power shifted naturally. It was messy, imperfect, and occasionally violent, but it was also responsive. The leaders who failed to serve the community's interests were replaced by ones who did. The economy of Pirate Nassau was surprisingly functional. Captured goods were sold and traded openly. Taverns, brothels, and markets sprang up to service the pirate population. Local merchants who had been ignored by the British colonial government suddenly had a thriving customer base. Ships were repaired and refitted in the harbor. Alliances were formed and dissolved. And for roughly a decade, this community of outcasts, criminals, former slaves, and runaway sailors operated as one of the freest societies in the Western Hemisphere. It ended, of course. In 1718, King George I sent Woodes Rogers to Nassau with a royal pardon in one hand and a fleet of warships in the other. Accept the pardon, return to law-abiding life, or be hunted and hanged. Many pirates accepted. Some did not. Charles Vane famously sailed right past Rogers' ships, guns blazing, refusing to surrender. But for those years when Nassau was the Republic of Pirates, it stood as living proof that the men governments called lawless barbarians had built something those governments could not, a society where a man's vote mattered more than his bloodline. So why did pirate democracy work, and why did it ultimately fail? It worked because of incentives. Every man on a pirate ship had skin in the game. The ship's success was their success. The ship's failure was their failure. There were no absentee owners collecting dividends in London. There were no aristocratic officers who had purchased their commissions rather than earning them. Every member of the crew had a financial stake in the outcome and a political voice in the decisions. It worked because the alternative was known. These men had lived under tyranny. They had been flogged, starved, cheated, and discarded by the Merchant Marine and the Royal Navy. They knew exactly what unchecked authority looked like because they had the scars on their backs. When they designed their system of governance, they designed it specifically to prevent the abuses they had personally experienced. It worked because the crews were small enough for direct democracy to function. A pirate ship might carry between 50 and 300 men. That is small enough for every voice to be heard, every vote to be counted, and every leader to be held accountable face to face. You cannot ignore a man's grievance when he is sleeping 6 feet from you and carrying a pistol. And it failed because empires do not tolerate alternatives. The golden age of piracy ended not because pirate democracy was flawed, but because the governments of the world decided to destroy it. England, France, and Spain invested enormous resources in hunting pirates. They sent warships. They offered pardons to divide pirate communities. They held public executions designed to terrorize anyone who might consider the pirate life. They hanged men at the waterline and left their bodies in iron cages to rot as a warning. The trials themselves were a spectacle of propaganda. When Bartholomew Roberts's crew was captured in 1722, 264 men were put on trial at Cape Coast Castle in West Africa. It was the largest pirate trial in history. 77 of them were of African descent. The judges made sure the public heard every gruesome detail of pirate life while carefully ignoring every detail about what life was like on the ships these men had left behind. No one asked why so many sailors had chosen piracy over the merchant marine. No one asked why men would risk the gallows rather than return to a system that flogged them for spilling soup. Those questions were not part of the script. 52 men were hanged. The rest were sentenced to hard labor in the mines or sold into indentured servitude, which was, for all practical purposes, a slower form of the death sentence. The message was clear. You can submit to our system, or you can die. There is no third option. Between 1716 and 1726, the British alone hanged over 400 pirates. The Golden Age was drowned in blood, not because pirates couldn't govern themselves, but because their example was dangerous. A sailor who heard that pirate crews voted for their captains, shared profits equally, and provided for their injured might start asking uncomfortable questions about why his own ship didn't work that way. A dock worker in London who heard about the Articles of Agreement might wonder why his employer offered no such contract. A pressed man dragged onto a warship might dream of the black flag not as a symbol of terror, but as a symbol of freedom. And that was a question no empire could afford to let spread. There is a final irony to this story that is worth sitting with. When the founding fathers of the United States sat down to design a new form of government in Philadelphia in 1787, they drew inspiration from ancient Athens, from the Roman Republic, from Enlightenment philosophers like Locke and Montesquieu and Rousseau. They debated for months. They consulted centuries of political theory. And the system they built was revolutionary, genuinely revolutionary. Elected leaders, separation of powers, a written constitution, individual rights. But that system also restricted voting to white, property-owning men. It preserved slavery. It excluded women. It counted enslaved people as 3/5 of a person for the purposes of political representation, a calculation so coldly mathematical that it still chills the blood. It took centuries of struggle, civil war, constitutional amendments, and social movements to extend the franchise to anything approaching universal suffrage. Women in America could not vote until 1920. The Civil Rights Act was not passed until 1964. The Voting Rights Act came in 1965. The system the founders built was a beginning, not a finished product. Pirates, a century before the Constitutional Convention, were already there. Not perfectly, not completely, not without their own contradictions and cruelties. Pirates could be vicious. They could be murderous. They terrorized innocent merchant sailors and left a trail of violence across the Atlantic. Acknowledging their democratic innovations does not erase those realities. But the core principles, elected leadership, checks on power, equitable distribution of resources, compensation for injury, and a voice for every man, regardless of background, were all present in pirate articles decades before they appeared in any national constitution. The men who built pirate democracy were not educated philosophers. They were desperate, pragmatic, often violent men who had been chewed up and spit out by the most powerful empires on earth. And they looked at those empires and said, "We can do better." They were right. History called them criminals. The empires they challenged wrote the history books, so that is the version that survived. But if you strip away the propaganda and look at what pirates actually built, the voting, the constitutions, the separation of powers, the economic equality, the disability compensation, you're looking at one of the most radical democratic experiments in human history. It happened on wooden ships in the middle of the ocean. It was built by men with nothing left to lose. And it was destroyed by governments that feared what it represented far more than any cannon or cutlass. The pirate flag did not stand for chaos. It stood for a world where your voice mattered, where your labor earned its fair share, and where no man was above the law he had agreed to follow. Every empire they sailed against has since fallen. The principles they fought for are still standing.